test results. Bacteria, whether there's any bacteria seen, and cast come from the kidneys usually. So let's go into the CBC. Stands for complete blood count. You have a white blood cell count, a red blood cell count. You have a hemoglobin and hematocrit. Now let's just talk about that for a minute. White blood cells are part of the immune system that God has put in our bodies to help us combat infection, inflammation, cancer, and so forth, right? The normal there is up to around 10,800 white cells. An average vegetarian, not a fishitarian, but a true vegetarian, is probably going to run in usually the low 4, occasionally high 3s, but mostly 4 to 5,000. Huh? I don't know. It's just the body, I guess, doesn't need as much because you're healthier. Yeah. Yeah. Now, when you start getting meat and so forth, and you're eating meat, because most of it is, you know, the animals are often sacrificed now, and it's not a pleasant experience, I'm sure, for the animals. And it's, you know, they're not killed easily. There is a stress involved with that, and they are dumping out probably a lot of the hormones into their bloodstream that we take in, cortisols and so forth. And cortisone does elevate the blood white cells, no question about it. And probably that's another reason. Plus we get into all the purines that are in the meats and so forth. It's a stimulating type of food, and the white cells are often higher in someone who is on a meat diet. If you get an acute infection, like a bacterial infection, the white blood cell count usually rises, and the type of white blood cells that are predominant, if you'll look down under the platelet count, you'll see neutrophils. It's just a type of white blood cell that usually responds in a bacterial infection. Now, in viral infections, in contrast to bacteria, you may see a little bit of rise in the white blood cell count, but you may have a normal white blood cell count or a depressed white blood cell count. And a lot of times you may see a predominance not of neutrophils, but of lymphocytes. In certain hematologic blood-borne diseases, you can get abnormalities in these white cell ratios. We call them lymphoproliferative disorders like lymphocytic leukemia, lymphomas, and so forth. The lymphocyte count may be elevated, and the total number of lymphs. So anytime, even if we see somebody with just a minimally elevated white count, but if the lymphocytes predominate, it's a red flag, because normally your neutrophils are to be in the predominance over your lymphocytes, normally. So this could be the precursor of some lymphoproliferative disorders if the lymphocyte count is higher than the neutrophil count. We're all familiar with hemoglobin and hematocrit, I think. You know, this is what reflects anemia. Hemoglobin is that portion of the red blood cell. It contains a protein fraction and an iron fraction, the heme portion. That's why they call it hemoglobin. Globin is the protein. And basically that is the part in the red blood cell that carries the oxygen. If you have low hemoglobin levels, it's usually a reflector of a low red cell count, and you're anemic. That's what we call it when you have a low level of hemoglobin. Hematocrit is just the ratio of the red blood cell mass to the liquid compartment of the blood, the fluid compartment. And both will usually go down in anemias. Usually the hematocrit is about 3 times what the hemoglobin is. That's a rough rule. So anytime you see a low hemoglobin and hematocrit, the person is usually said to be anemic. Now, the MCV is the mean corpuscular volume, and it just has to do with the size of the red blood cell. As the red blood cell gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the MCV gets less and less and less. A larger red blood cell, the MCV will get larger and larger and larger. Now, the physician can look at that and tell how to categorize anemias. Most anemias that are associated with just disease states, chronic illness, they're normocytic. Normocytic, that means that the MCV is normal. If you would tend to have, let's say, iron deficiency, either in young ladies that are losing a lot of blood, you know, with the menstrual cycle every month, or in older people who are past reproductive age, you have to start worrying about blood loss from the colon or the bowel that can cause iron deficiency. Anything that will cause you to lose blood, the iron deficiency states come up. And so if the physician's looking at that, and let's say the hemoglobin's 10, and you've got let's say a person that is 35, having fairly normal periods, otherwise healthy, and a fair amount of blood loss with her periods, the first thing you think about is iron deficiency anemia, and you put that lady on iron. Have her increase her iron-containing foods and so forth. If the lady's 57 and she comes in, and she is, let's say, 7 years past menstrual bleeding, and she is anemic, and she's got an MCV of 65, the first thing you think, this lady has some occult problem in the bowel and she's losing blood. We've got to then investigate that, okay? So that MCV lets us know what types of anemia are most likely. Some of your inherited anemias, you've heard of thalassemia, you know, it's a type of inherited anemia. It produces a small red blood cell. You may even have a normal hemoglobin and a normal hematocrit, but the MCV is very small. Think of an inherited hemoglobin problem, and then we do a hemoglobin evaluation. If you start to get large red blood cells, so the MCV is going up and the total blood counts, hemoglobin and hematocrit, are going down, then we think about certain diseases such as B12 deficiency that causes these large red blood cells. We call them megaloblast, and so we call it a megaloblastic anemia. Somebody that has had poor nutrition that can get folate deficient, it can also cause large red blood cells. And then there are certain lymphoproliferative disorders that cause a problem in the bone marrow with the maturation of the cells. These are usually pre-malignant or malignant. They can cause large red blood cells. The MCH is mean corpuscular volume, MCHC, mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. I'm sorry, MCH is mean corpuscular hemoglobin, and the other is mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. Those will usually go up and down as the MCV. That's all it is. It's what's in the red cell. Platelet counts. Platelets are those substances that float around in the blood cells that help the blood to clot. And you can get certain problems with low platelet counts, high platelet counts. You may see primary disorders where there is an overproduction of platelets because of a premalignant or malignant disorder. You may see platelet counts that are low for a variety of reasons. Certain infections, like somebody with hepatitis or chronic hepatitis, they may have low platelet counts. You can have certain autoimmune disorders where you are consuming platelets, destroying them. If you've ever heard of, it's called ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenia. They're just different diseases, but that's what the platelets are. They're the substances that normally circulate in the bloodstream, and when they come to, let's say, like if you cut your skin, why don't you just keep losing blood? You got a rent in one of the capillaries. Why don't you just leak and leak and leak? No, God put these little platelets in there, and when they sense an irregularity in the lumen of any vessel, even the capillaries, those little platelets come there and they just stick. And as they aggregate there, they begin to form a plug, and then they release certain clotting factors that when the blood that's normally going through there, it activates those clotting mechanisms in the blood, and the blood starts to clot. Isn't that amazing? I tell you, this body is just phenomenal the way God made it. So that's the platelets. We talked about the different types of white blood cells, neutrophils, lymphocytes. I'm not going to get into monocytes, eosinophils, basophils, except to say this. RDW is a, where is that? Yeah, that is a red cell, what do they call it? It's another measurement of a dimension, and it has to do with mixed types of anemias. Like if you were to have a B12 deficiency and an iron deficiency state, it gives a clue because the RDW is elevated. It's just another one of these measurements, and I'm trying to think of what that RDW stands for. It's red cell something. We don't use it very much unless the person is anemic and we're trying to see what may be causing that. The eosinophils are there in increased concentrations if you have allergy states, if you have parasitic disease, or if you have primary eosinophilic infiltrative disease processes. And there's certain types of disease that can produce eosinophilia. Okay, the TSH down at the bottom is thyroid stimulating hormone level. You will see the reference there is 0.4 to 4.5. The thyroid stimulating hormone level comes out of the pituitary. It drives the thyroid. If the thyroid gland for some reason is not functioning well, and let's say it doesn't put out normal amounts of the hormones T4 and T3, then the brain senses that, and immediately the pituitary gland will release increasing amounts of stimulating hormone that will act upon that thyroid and try to stimulate that thyroid to produce more hormone. So one of the earliest signs of hypothyroidism is normal levels of thyroid hormone, but a rising TSH level. That's called subclinical hypothyroid. Now, it'll finally come to the point where the gland can't keep up enough with that driving thyroid stimulating level, and it will fall even though the high TSH level is there. So if you see a high TSH, let it be a clue to the possibility of a hypothyroid state either developing or present. 0.4 to